The Battle of Fontenoy, the 11th of May 1745, was a major engagement of the War of the Austrian Succession, fought between the forces of the Pragmatic Allies, comprising mainly Dutch, British, and Hanoverian troops under the command of the Duke of Cumberland, and a French army under Maurice de Saxe, commander of King Louis XV's forces in the Low Countries. The battle was one of the most important in the war and considered the masterpiece of Marshal Saxe, serving France. King Louis XV, and his son, the Dauphin, were present at the battle. Napoleon I later declared that the victory at Fontenoy prolonged the ancient regime monarchy in France by 30 years. Saxe went on the offensive in April 1745 with a large French army, looking to build on the previous year's gains. His initial aim was to take control of the Upper Scheldt Basin and thereby gain access to the heart of the Austrian Netherlands. To these ends, he first besieged the fortress of Tournai, protecting the siege with his main force about 5 miles southeast of the town. In order to relieve Tournai, the Allies first decided to attack Saxe's position, a naturally strong feature, hinged on the village of Fontenoy and further strengthened by defensive works. After failing to make progress on the flanks, the Dutch on the left, Brigadier Ingoldsby's brigade on the right, Cumberland decided to smash his way through the centre without securing the flanks of his main attack. Despite devastating flanking fire, the Allied column, made up of British and Hanoverian infantry, burst through the French lines to the point of victory. Only when Saxe concentrated all available infantry, cavalry, and artillery was the column forced to yield. The Allies retreated in good order, conducting a fighting withdrawal. The battle had shown, however, the strength of a defensive force relying on firepower and a strong reserve. Casualties were high on both sides, but the French had gained the field, and Tournai fell shortly after the battle. This success was followed by a rapid advance against the less organized and outnumbered Allied army. Ghent, Oudenarde, Bruges, Dendermonde soon fell to French forces. The British Army's withdrawal to England to deal with the Jacobite rising facilitated the French capture of the strategically important ports of Ostend and Nieuwpoort, threatening Britain's links to the Low Countries. By the year's end, the Saxon-born Saxe had completed the conquest of much of the Austrian Netherlands, and with his successes he became a national hero in his adopted country. The battle had established the French superiority in force and high command. Background: in 1744, France went over to the offensive in the Low Countries. King Louis XV and the Duke of Noailles scored early successes with the capture of the frontier fortresses of Western Flanders. Menin, Ypres, and Knock fell in June, while Ferns was taken in July. The whole southern sector of maritime Flanders was soon in French hands. But the strategic situation abruptly changed when Prince Charles of Lorraine led 70,000 imperial troops across the Rhine and into Alsace. To counter this threat, Louis XV and Noailles led large reinforcements south, while Maurice de Saxe, illegitimate son of Augustus II the Strong, since March, a Marshal of France, was left in charge in Flanders with a reduced army of between 50,000 to 60,000 men facing an allied army of 96,000. Opposing Saxe was the Pragmatic Army, the bulk of which was made up of British and Hanoverian troops under General George Wade, and Dutch troops under Prince Maurice of Nassau. Much had been expected of the Allies in 1744, but the timidity of their generals had produced nothing against a numerically inferior enemy. Although Wade eventually advanced towards Lille, he did little more than bicker with the Austrians about the cost of moving his siege train from Antwerp. Saxe was able to maintain his position at Courtrai and along the lines of the Lys, and remained relatively untroubled throughout. In part, the risible results of the Allied campaign in the Low Countries had led to the fall of the Carteret government in Britain, leading to a new administration led by Henri Pelham and his brother, the Duke of Newcastle. Elsewhere, the Pragmatic Allies had scored considerable success in late 1744, A joint Austro-Saxon force under Charles of Lorraine and Count Traun drove Frederick II's Prussian army from Bohemia and Piedmont. Sardinia had expelled the Bourbons from northern Italy. Further success followed with the death in January 1745 of the French puppet, Emperor Charles VII. When his successor, Maximilian III Joseph, hesitated over peace proposals, the Austrians launched a rapid campaign, culminating in April with the Franco-Bavarian defeat of the decisive Battle of Pfaffenhofen. Max Joseph sued for peace and gave his support for the candidacy of Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen, in the coming imperial election for the vacant throne. With Bavaria out of the war, the Austrians could now try to win back Silesia from Frederick II. Likewise, Bavarian repudiation of its French ties meant France was freed of its German involvement, and could now concentrate on its own military efforts in Italy and the Low Countries. As early as December 1744, Saxe had prepared plans for a spring offensive in the Low Countries. He had made up his mind not only what he would do, but what he would compel his enemy to do, correctly calculating the operational and political difficulties that such a diverse opponent would face. This opponent comprised Britain, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and Saxony, who had concluded the defensive Treaty of Warsaw in January 1745, the Quadruple Alliance, by which all contractants committed themselves to uphold the Pragmatic Sanction and the House of Austria's claim to the imperial crown. To the Low Countries, the British sent the son of King George II, the 24-year-old Duke of Cumberland, as the new Captain-General of Britain's army, while Maria Theresa sent the experienced Count Königsegg to command Austrian forces. The trio of generals was completed by Prince Waldeck, commander of the Dutch contingent in theatre. They hoped to gain the initiative by the establishment of forward magazines and an early opening of the campaign season. Major supply and ammunition depot magazines were set up for the British by General Ligonier at Ghent, Oudenarde and Tournai, while the Dutch General van der Duin placed theirs at Mons, Charleroi and Tournai. Prelude. The Duke of Cumberland, the nominal commander-in-chief of the United Allied Force, arrived at The Hague on 18 April 1745. 2 days later he arrived at Brussels, where the Allied army was to concentrate. Here he met Königsegg, Waldeck, and General de Wendt, commander of the Hanoverian contingent, who had orders to fight in close coordination with the British. According to a State of the Allied troops sent home by Cumberland, the Allied army's effective strength was less than 43,000, consisting of 30,550 infantry and 12,000 cavalry. However, this number was growing, and reinforcements would eventually bring his army up to 53,000. And for a brief time an irrepressible optimism pervaded the Allied councils of war. The youthful Cumberland had designs on a campaign that would culminate in Paris. But the more experienced Ligonier, Cumberland's mentor and commander of the British infantry, warned that France's numerical advantage meant the Allies must, by their situation, be masters of besieging wherever they please. And so the Allies fell back on a defensive strategy while awaiting clear evidence of Saxe's intentions. Saxe, stricken with dropsy, left Paris for the front in Flanders on 31 March. On 20 April he reached his base of operations at Maubeuge, gathering his army totaling some 95,000 men, consisting of 69,000 infantry and 25,600 cavalry. In this campaign Saxe had one primary aim: take control of the upper Scheldt basin and hence the heart of the Austrian Netherlands. For this he had enlisted the services of the Duke of Noailles and Count Lowendahl, a Dane who had gained experience in the Great Northern War. The French campaign to gain the initiative began immediately. On 21 April Comte d'Estrées set off in the direction of Mons with a force of cavalry, while Du Chaillu, pursuing a different route, set out with the intention of uniting with d'Estrées in the vicinity of that town. However, this movement was only a feint to disguise Sax's real intention of besieging Tournai. It was a deception that had the desired effect on the Allied command. "By all the intelligence I have from different parts," wrote Cumberland on the 23rd of April, "the real design of the enemy is to besiege Mons," adding, "The Marshal Count Saxe is at Malberg and is in so low a state that his death is daily expected," while the Allies were at Brussels making dispositions to march to the relief of Mons. Saxe slipped down the Scheldt with the main body of the army towards his real target, one column on the left bank of the river, and two columns on the right to cover the march and engage the Allies in battle. The capture of Tournai would consolidate and extend the gains that had been made in the previous campaign, and provide the French with the key to the approaches of Ghent and Oudenarde, threatening British communications with Ostend and the sea. Yet the siege was also a decoy for a much more original maneuver, the prompt engagement of the enemy in a place favourable to the French army, and at a time before the Allies could reach their full strength. Although Saxe favoured movement over siege warfare, he knew there was nothing more likely to provoke an early encounter than to threaten one of the Allies' larger fortresses, which only the most confident and able commander could ignore. The French opened their trenches around Tournai on the 30th of April, exactly in accordance with the memorial presented by Saxe to Versailles in December 1744. Saxe entrusted the investment to Lowendahl, while he himself turned his attention towards the gathering Allied army. The true intentions of the French were not discovered by the Allies until the 28th of April. "After a good deal of variety and contradiction," wrote Cumberland's secretary, "our advices for 2 or 3 days past agree that the enemy's army is before Tournai." Due to indecision, the Allies had not begun its march until the 30th of April, reaching Soignies on the 2nd of May, where they were detained due to bad weather. On the 5th of May the Allies reached Cambrai. Here, a reserve corps was formed under Hanoverian General Moltke, and detached towards Luz, where 50 French squadrons under Duchesneau were stationed as a corps of observation. Duchesneau at once withdrew in the direction of Tournai, but he had achieved his object. He had satisfied himself as to which road the Allies would approach. Preliminary skirmishes from Cambrai, the Allies marched to Molbay and to within the sound of the siege guns at Tournai. Even now Cumberland was still unsure of the situation facing him. "I cannot come at any certain knowledge of the enemy's numbers, but I have concurring information that the body on this side the Scheldt does not exceed 31 battalions and 32 squadrons. The reports vary of the progress of the siege. The weather is so bad that, though we are within a distance to hear the cannon very distinctly, yet no true judgment can be formed from thence whether the enemy are retired over the Scheldt or not." On the evening of the 9th of May the Allies at last reached the final stage of their tiring march, encamping their left wing on Morbray, and their right on Barnes, almost within musket shot of the French outposts. Tournai lay 6 miles to the northwest. French reconnaissances had confirmed Saxe in his belief that the Allies would endeavour to relieve Tournai by attempting to force a passage from the southeast via the hamlet of Fontenoy and the small town of Antoing on the Scheldt. The French commander now cast about for a good spot where he might await the attack in security, finally settling on a potentially strong defensive position on the eastern side of the Scheldt, about 5 miles southeast of Tournai. To guard against any breakout by the Dutch from within the besieged city, the Marquis of Droby-Arreacourt was left with 21,550 men in the trenches, and orders to contain the garrison of about 8,000 men at all costs. Louis XV took to the field in person, accompanied by his son Louis, and their enormous retinue. After observing the siege at Tournai, the king moved on to the Château de Calonne between Tournai and Antoing. That same day, the 8th of May, Saxe began to move his main troops into position to face the Pragmatic Army. During a hasty reconnoitre late on the 9th of May, Cumberland, Koenigsegg, and Waldeck found the French fortifying the hamlet of Fontenoy. They also discovered the enemy's pickets at the villages of Vezin and Bergen. These outposts were dealt with on the following day. On the right, the British under General Campbell moved to take Vezin, where Cumberland subsequently moved his headquarters, while the Dutch on the left possessed themselves of Bergen. The Allied forward units now held the Peronne-Bergen-Vezin line. After another reconnoitre, the Allied commanders resolved to defer the battle until the morning of the 11th. But all agreed that the French position, the barrier between themselves and Tournai, must be attacked. Opposing armies. When the two armies finally met on the field, they were approximately equal in numbers. While there is not complete agreement among historians on the exact numbers, there is general agreement that there were about 50,000 on each side, with the French having more cavalry and the Allies having more infantry. Some historians put the French as more numerous and others the Allies. The Allied army consisted of some 53,000 men in 52 battalions and 85 squadrons, of which 22,000 were Dutch, 21,000 were British, 8,000 Hanoverian and 2,000 Austrians. They had 80 to 105 cannon. The French army had some 48,000 men, 32,000 infantry in 55 battalions and 14,000 cavalry in 101 squadrons, and 90 to 110 cannon, at least 86 of which were small 4-pound battalion guns. The French army was commanded by one of the great captains of the age, but it had fallen behind some of the other powers in tactics, training and discipline. Historian David Chandler quotes Saxe. Chandler also states that Saxe admired the superior discipline and formations of the Allies, and quotes from a letter that Saxe wrote to Frederick the Great in September 1746. In contrast, the Pragmatic Army contained some of the better trained and disciplined troops of Europe in the British and Hanoverian contingents, but were not blessed with a great captain to command him. The young, 26-year-old Cumberland owed his position to his high rank, and he had no prior experience commanding an army. The Battle of Fontenoy, the 11th of May 1745, was a major engagement of the War of the Austrian Succession, fought between the forces of the Pragmatic Allies, comprising mainly Dutch, British, and Hanoverian troops under the command of the Duke of Cumberland, and a French army under Maurice de Saxe, commander of King Louis XV's forces in the Low Countries. The battle was one of the most important in the war, and considered the Allies retreated in good order, conducting a fighting withdrawal. The battle had shown, however, the strength of a defensive force relying on firepower and a strong reserve. Casualties were high on both sides, but the French had gained the field, and Tournai fell shortly after the battle. This success was followed by a rapid advance against the less organized and outnumbered Allied army. Ghent, Oudenarde, Bruges, Dendermonde soon fell flanks, the Dutch on the left, Brigadier Ingoldsby's brigade on the right. Cumberland decided to smash his way through the centre without securing the flanks of his main attack. Despite devastating flanking fire, the Allied column, made up of British and Hanoverian infantry, burst through the French lines to the point of victory. Only when Saxe concentrated all available infantry, cavalry, and artillery was the column forced to yield. A masterpiece of Marshal Saxe, serving France, King Louis XV, and his son, the Dauphin, were present at the battle. Napoleon I later declared that the victory at Fontenoy prolonged the ancient regime monarchy in France by 30 years. Saxe went on the offensive in April 1745 with a large French army, looking to build on the previous year's gains. His initial aim was to take control of the upper Scheldt basin and thereby gain access to the heart of the Austrian Netherlands. To these ends, he first besieged the fortress of Tournai, protecting the siege with his main force about 5 miles southeast of the town. In order to relieve Tournai, the Allies first decided to attack Saxe's position, a naturally strong feature, hinged on the village of Fontenoy and further strengthened by defensive works. After failing to make progress on the